Thank you for having me. It's pretty cool to be the first speaker in this series. And Andy had actually asked me originally to talk about rebuilding fish stocks, and I thought that was boring. I hear about cod all the time, so there's other things to talk about. And if you talk about the great success stories, one of those is the one that Andy was alluding to with right whales. When we got together back in 97, 98, everyone thought the right whales were going down the tubes. And they've become one of the great success stories. The population is now increasing 2 to 3% a year, which for right whales is a big deal. It's been a steady increase since about the time we took over. And the agency holds that up as a great example of how you can recover a really highly endangered species, recognizing that at that point there were less than 300 animals. Now we're approaching close to 500. So that's a success story. And in a lot of ways, this is sort of the story about my history working with the agency and about the agency itself. So there's a big story here about recovery. Because when NOAA was formed back in the 70s, they pulled together all these different groups that became NOAA. What became National Fisheries Service was the Bureau of Commercial Fisheries, which was in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And at that time, basically all they did was, they sort of monitored fisheries quotas. There weren't really quotas. They gave advice to international organizations. There was nothing like we have now. And as a consequence, what we had Russian trawlers that you can see offshore of here, with no quotas, catch as many fish as they want. And then for herring, that was one of the reasons herring is depleted in all of U.S. waters. Marine mammal species, most of the large whales were on their way to extinction because of overharvesting. Bottlenose dolphins and other dolphins out in the Western Pacific were similarly in a downward spiral because of bycatch in a variety of fisheries, but mostly the purse seine fishery for tunas. Seals populations were really low. So basically, you look across the board, and almost all those species that NOAA came to take over as stewardship mission were in trouble. And that was what NOAA was charged with doing. So the history of NOAA, these NOAA fisheries, over the last 40 years, has been fundamentally shaped by this idea of rebuilding, or restoration, or recovery, a variety of things, but basically it's the same idea. So what I'm going to talk about, basically, is challenges, successes, and some consequences of the success. And I'm not going to go too far into the details because it gets very esoteric and confusing, and I don't understand half of the stuff about why we recover things. But I'll give you some of the ideas. So if you want to think about how we deal with trying to recover a fish versus a whale, this will give you a sort of a primer for it. And we'll start with challenges. Now, those are the three acts that really changed NOAA. So when NOAA was formed, the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and the Magnuson-Stevens Act didn't exist. So very shortly afterwards, these acts came into play. And they actually talked, all of them, about recovery. Different terms. So under the Endangered Species Act, we talked about endangered and threatened. Under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, we talked about depleted. Under the Magnuson Act, it's overfished. But basically, they're all conceptually the same thing. But there's some reference point there that we don't want a population to be below. We want to get above it. Because we think it's either it's healthy for the ecosystem, or if you want a commercial harvest on fish, you got to get them out of that overfish stuff because they're in trouble there. And what you don't want to do is ever get a fish stock down in the danger zone. So that meant we had a lot of species to deal with. And there's an incredible taxonomy of species here that we're supposed to know something about. Recognize ESA can be most anything. The only thing we don't deal with are insects. We deal with plants. We have Johnson seagrass, which is a listed species in the Caribbean. We deal with mammals, and we also deal with foreign species. So harbor porpoise in the U.S. is fine, but the Mexican version is called Depleted. That's a listed species because of its population size. Corals, that's a new big deal for us. We are recently petitioned, so people can ask us to list 66 species of corals. When we went through a review of that, we found there were 22 that were actually in trouble, so we listed those. Salmonids, including Atlantic salmon, and all the West Coast salmons, all the turtle species, and then lots of marine and anadromous species. And really the action right now for us is people petitioning us to list marine species. So in this area, cusk, for example, was one we just recently dealt with. We've had to deal with river herring. We've dealt with oysters in the Chesapeake Bay. We had a lot of petitions from citizens, and that's good. That's a great way for us to get advice. We take those under consideration and determine whether they're sufficiently reduced that we want to consider them listed in the ESA. For marine mammals, there are 117 species worldwide that we deal with, and of those within the U.S., we separate a lot of those out into multiple stocks. So for bottlenose dolphins, for example, we have every bay, sound, and estuary in the Gulf of Mexico is considered to be a separate stock, even if it's all the same species. So we deal with managing all those. And then under the Magnuson Act and the MSRA, there are 416 domestic fish stocks that we deal with right now that are parts of fisheries management plans. Most of those are not commercially important, but they are taken. So we manage those. So there's a lot there. And we are charged basically with monitoring all of those. Everything that's on that list is something that we are charged by Congress, keeping them above that depletion line or overfishing line, recovering basically. So conceptually, if you want to figure out when do we really worry about something, you look at a relationship like this, and the balloon line, so that's a hypothetical population size. Beginning with 1950, say it's up at this level, and let's just say it's declining. If this was a species, as long as it's up here, we probably wouldn't be too worried about it, because it was close to what its maximum could be, and it wasn't above one of these thresholds that we're worried about. So we could call that like a depleted threshold or an overfishing or something. But at this point, we start to worry about this population size. If it declines further, then we get down into this territory, which is the Endangered Species Act. And what we really would like to avoid is getting the population down in this last little bin. However you define that, because at that point, the population may be not recoverable. So we do everything we can to implement management measures all through this to keep the population from declining further if it's declining. And when we started off back in the 70s, many of those species we saw on that list were down either in here or in here. All the large whales were down in here. Most of the seal populations and dolphin populations were somewhere down in here. So here in the fish stock, some were probably close to being in here. At that point, we didn't want to consider listing fish stocks other than salmonids under the Endangered Species Act. So what Congress told us to do is you got to get them out of this domain and get them back up in here. So that's the whole idea of rebuilding and recovery. You're down here, you want to get them back up there. So Congress, in its independent guidance, says, here's how to do it. You develop a plan. Okay, so these plans usually are these long documents. The short ones are maybe 100 pages long. Some of them are 200 to 300 pages long. But what it comes down to, ultimately, is that there are a limited number of things that can cause the population to be down there. It could be because of the habitat loss. Not so much a big issue for marine species, but a major issue for terrestrial species. Overutilization. And this was probably the biggest issue for almost all our species. The harvest was too big. It could be commercial or recreational. So figure that, for large whales, they have been heavily harvested for some of these species for centuries. So right whales, the reason the population was so small is that it had been harvested by various groups going back into the 17th century. To the point where in the late 1900s, early 20th century, they are already considered to be endangered under separate international acts. And in theory, we're supposed to stop all harvest. Well, it did in these waters, but it continued to occur in the Western Pacific. So the population in the Western Pacific, which used to be actually larger than this population, is now down to the point where if we look and look and look, and there's maybe a dozen of the Pacific right whales left, because the Russians continued to harvest those into the 60s. Disease or predation, there's potential there, particularly for some of the marine mammal species have issues here. On the West Coast, you'll frequently hear stories about particularly right now, this year, about lots of animals dying because of ocean conditions, because of diseases that go along with that. Then there are, we'd like to hope that we actually have a way to protect these animals, but frequently we don't. So the IWS, International Whaling Commission, in theory, provides protection for large whales. They don't really have any teeth in their race. They don't really control U.S. whalers or Russian whalers. The IWC was in existence when the Russians were extirpating large whales from the Western Pacific, and they weren't able to control that. And finally, there are other things that can cause declines. So one of the issues we've had with right whales, and that Andy and I worked on, was ship strike. There were two major reasons for the right whale population decline in recent history. One was entanglement fishing gear, but the bigger one may have been ship strike. So one of the big things we did over that period, working on recovering right whales, was to develop a plan for reducing ship strike. And that meant slowing ships down and then moving ships out of areas where you knew there were big concentrations of right whales. And that worked. Since we put that into place, we haven't seen a ship strike right whale. And because we moved them away from areas where there are humpback whales and fin whales and blue whales, we haven't seen any dead other whales either. So you can get collateral effects from good management actions. But where this all fits together is, there are scientists who work on this, and they work collaboratively with management, and they try to develop a collaborative plan that will help guide recovery. And doing it this way, so you've got the two working together, it winds up with developing management plans that can probably be better for the affected industries as well. Trying to be parsimonious when we came up with areas that we would close for right whales meant that we wanted to see where fishing effort was and see if we could separate out fishing effort from where the whales were. So we didn't want to shut down fisheries. The same thing's happening with the gear research on right whales, trying to develop gear solutions that reduce right whale mortality, but also allow the lobster fishery to proceed. So this can be a really powerful team. And a lot of this has evolved over the last 10 to 15 years. So in the end, hopefully what you've got here is an effective recovery management. So then we need to know, when are you there? And that big plan we did for the ESA species, they list in there when you think you're at least no longer in that endangered or threatened category. So you want to get out of that bin. For MMPA, it's just basically like the Magnuson Act. When the population is sufficiently large to sustain a population that is optimally sustainable production, or at what's called MSY for fish, maximum sustainable yield. So it's basically a pretty high population, far above an area where we'd be worried about the population being of conservation concern. And it varies with individual species. And if you're dealing with a fast-growing species like herring, this issue of what the population size is really different than if you're dealing with rockfish. It can take forever to reproduce. So the thing to realize, though, is the game isn't quite the same now as it was 20 or 30 years ago. Right? The system is changing. It was changing 20 or 30 years ago, but now what we're seeing is that sort of annual variability that we see in marine systems, still there, but there's a long-term trend in change. If you look at the Gulf of Maine, one of the things we're seeing here is that, yes, there's a lot of interannual variability. There's a lot of change in sea surface temperature from year to year, and you expect that. There are warm years and cold years. But as you plot out the long-term trend, what you see is there's an upward trend in sea surface temperature. Somebody's driving that. But what that does is, it then affects things like what your baseline would be. You may not be able to rebuild the population to the level that you thought you could because the system has changed. And we're just now coming to grips with how to deal with this. Cod may be a good example. It may be that we can never rebuild cod to those great historic levels of the Grand Banks fisheries existing. We can rebuild cod, but to what level? Right whales may be the same way. So this is a national dialogue that's going on of what the baseline should be. It's really the biggest issue for dealing with the Magnuson Act and the Environmental Protection Act, because they key everything to this historical population size. For the Endangered Species Act, you really just worry about getting species out of that risk zone. But it's a little bit different. So we can actually deal more simply with ESA's risk approach than with the MMPA and the Magnuson Act, the Fisheries Act. So, what successes I'm seeing? For marine mammals, the MMPA, the Environmental Protection Act, has been a resounding success. So all these upward lines, these are just typical changes that we've seen basically over the last period of time, showing almost every one of the marine mammal populations that we manage, populations increasing. Whether that's good or bad is a separate issue, but it's been effective. Okay? And basically, it's been effective because we've had a total moratorium on take. But it worked. We've recovered, and compared to the rest of the world, we should be really proud of this that we've been able to do this. We're the only place in the world that's really seen this happen. This presents new challenges once these populations get high, but we've done a great thing here. Under the Endangered Species Act, we haven't lost any, which is good. We have populations that were really low, and recognize that they're all really low to start off with. So trying to rebuild them is a difficult task. It's not like with fishing where you remove fishing pressure and the population will almost immediately respond. For a population that's really low, there's a lot of things that allow it to come back. And some of those we have no idea what they are. We've seen marine mammal populations like elephant seals that their numbers were down in the hundreds. The population stayed like that for years, and then all of a sudden the population exploded. So something changed, and we're never quite sure what it was. Sea otters did the same thing. Down in the southern hemisphere, there were a whole group of fur seals. They were, as far as people knew, they were all extinct. And yet today, there are millions of fur seals. They stayed really low for a long time. So when you get down in that really low zone, it's really hard to quite predict what's going to happen. But so long as you remove the threats, the population most likely will come back again. And that's what we're seeing here. For the marine mammal populations that were listed, virtually all of them are moving up. Those that aren't are stable. We've delisted, actually we removed from the endangered species list some of the sea lions, gray whales. We're right now proposing to delist parts of the humpback whale population, which is a charismatic species up here, and the population has come roaring back. That population has been increasing around 6% a year in the Gulf of Maine. For turtles, the same thing. Most of those populations, and they were low for a bunch of reasons. The two major ones being is that people were harvesting turtles from their eggs, and that people were catching lots of turtles in fisheries. We dealt with the egg issue. Most of that was in Mexico or Costa Rica through conventions. And the fishing industry has been incredibly responsive in developing ways to reduce this bycatch. I think it's one of the great stories that we have not told well, is how the fishing industry has helped us with this. The turtle bycatch in the scallop fishery, for example, was extremely large. The scallop fishery developed a different kind of scallop dredge that, first of all, excluded turtles, basically loggerheads and Kemp's from going into the dredge. And then worrying that they were probably still running the turtles over, they developed a different front for the dredge so they would put turtles over the top. They wouldn't be run over. The scallop fishermen did that. We worked with them, but it was basically the scallop industry that did that. So that most of the turtle populations are doing well. It's a combination of those two. The only one that we're having problems with are leatherbacks. That's mostly a Pacific problem. In the U.S. waters, leatherbacks are also doing well. And then finally, marine and agri species. Right? And those are species up here, like sturgeon, Atlantic salmon, and river herring. Potentially, it's not a species that's listed right now, but it's a species of concern. And some of the smelts and eulicon, those species that come back into fresh water to spawn have issues. A lot of that's because of dams and loss of habitat. So if there's any one group of taxa that we worry about habitat, it's this anagamous species. We're also, there are a variety of marine species we've been petitioned to list. So much of our listing activity is occurring there. Most of the populations now are still low and they show little sign of recovery. So when you talk about salmon populations, wild salmon populations in Maine, you're talking about, if you're lucky, a few hundred animals. West Coast, similar sort of issues. Their habitat issues are enormous in the West Coast. You've heard about Central Valley drought. Well, that Central Valley was prime habitat, even in the desert, for salmon. And there simply is not enough water to restore those populations. So we can maintain them, keep them alive, keep them viable. If to see them actually rebuild is going to be really difficult. And as the drought continues in the Central Valley of California, it's just going to get worse. So that, for us, that's been the hardest nut to crack. But we continue to work with industry, with bondable power, work with the Bureau of Reclamation, with the Corps of Engineers, with the agriculture industry to try to come up with solutions to deal with that. And people are trying to do it, but it's a tough one on the West Coast. Now, Magnuson Act. As I said, we have a lot of species, and most of those are now restored. We had two designations we wanted to deal with. One was overfishing. Overfishing is where there's too much fishing going on, in the sense that we've estimated through stock assessment that the fishing mortality should be at a certain level, but as it turns out, we're fishing harder than that. So we want to reduce that fishing level back down to below what we said is the appropriate fishing level. The other is for stocks that are actually overfished. Those are ones where the population has fallen down below that threshold level. So we have two things we're trying to fix there. Dealing with the overfishing is a little bit easier than overfished, because industry helps, and they will reduce their effort. The part is done through quotas. But this downward trend basically shows how things have gotten better. We're now down to the point where most all stocks are no longer overfished. So this is something like around 7% of stocks are overfished, or experiencing overfishing, and something around 15% of stocks are considered to be overfished. But many of those are continuing to rebuild. We just haven't reached that level yet. All these stocks that are considered to be overfished are on a rebuilding plan. The goal there is to rebuild them over some time level. Compared to the rest of the world, I mean, there's probably nobody else that can say that 92% of their stocks are not experiencing overfishing, or that only 16% of their stocks are overfished. We've done a great success here, and that's, again, it's a combination of the agency working with the fishing industry to get there. There are problems. Cod's an issue. The red snapper is an issue in the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, there are issues, but by and large, we have really done a great job here, working as a team to recover most of these species that were overharvested previously by the Russians, the West Coast by the Japanese. So they come back. And in the last year, as an example, these are three species that are now considered to be no longer overfished. Gag group in the Gulf, foulfish in the Mid-Atlantic, and then butterfish, which ranges up here as well. So, great. We've done a pretty good job bringing things back, but there are consequences to that which we never really anticipated. This is sort of the challenges section. One is that we never thought much about interactions that would occur as species came back. So one of the problems we got is interaction between two listed species. California sea lions are still considered to be depleted and protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act here, and salmon are listed under the Endangered Species Act. So the sea lions feeding on the salmon, and trying to stop that is awkward because it's difficult for us to actually go out and collect sea lions. There's ways to do it, but administratively it's very difficult. Similarly, we have issues with competition for prey. We have a nice harbor seal here, and we have a cod. And seals prey on cod. They prey on little cod, they prey on big cod, but There's an interaction there. We also would like to prey on cod. So there's an issue there. That also occurs over here with salmon, because there's still salmon fisheries, and people get very upset when they have a sea lion come along and take a nice salmon that's on their troll line. They shoot them, both groups. I'm not giving any solutions here right now, but I'm saying here are issues we have to deal with. There's also this issue of how many species can we recover at once? Can we recover all the groundfish stocks and all the marine mammal stocks and all the turtle stocks in the same system? Or maybe the system can't hold those, even with a shifting without a shifting baseline. So as an example, this is some of the work that I was doing when I was on the other coast. The line here with the squares is pollock abundance, walleye pollock, which is the largest commercial fishery in the U.S. Not the largest commercial value, but the largest landings. So when I started with the agency, I was a foreign fishery observer. We had tows where there was 100 metric tons. Okay? Recognizing that the whole cod quota here is 200 metric tons. With one ship, one tow, 100 metric tons of pollock. Enormous fishery. And it didn't used to be as big. It grew during the mid to late 80s to a much higher abundance, 3 times what it was prior to that. It's actually gone up past there. At the same time, what we saw was a decline in herring abundance and stellar sea lion abundance. So maybe a relationship there. The issue is can this system, Bering Sea, sustain both populations at a high level? We've never seen a situation in Bering Sea where all 3 of these were high together. And it's a common characteristic of northern sort of ecosystems that there's these interactions between species. And usually people don't look much at the marine mammal part, but herring and cods like pollock and capeling frequently have an interaction and they play off each other. One's high, the other's low. So the expectation that we could have a really big pollock fishery and stellar sea lion populations back up in here may be unrealistic. So that's where the kind of work that Andy does come into play. Looking at trophy and ecosystem interactions. And then there's these other sort of things where because there's so many of the species that they impinge on us. These are recreational docks in Oregon. They're very recreational for the California sea lions. I don't think anybody understood that that's what's going to happen. It's reached a point now where there are NGOs that are building floating docks just for the sea lions. So let's try to stay away from these docks, which is probably a pretty good solution. Because right now we don't have a really good way of getting animals off of there. They're protected under the Animal Protection Act, so our hands are somewhat tied. And then there's unrealistic expectations for recovery. This picture up here at the right hand from the 1950s is a headboat in the Gulf of Mexico coming back from a successful day fishing for red snapper. And everybody caught lots of fish. So today, after the population had declined from those down, you see, this is where the population was back in that period. It declined down to here, and we're now on a rebuilding plan. The industry just doesn't understand, the recreational industry doesn't understand why they can't do that again. And we try to tell them, well, the populations are building. It's going to take a while for it to get back up to that level. They may never actually reach that level again. And they have a hard time understanding that. Because even prior to them, when the population was really low here, back in the 90s and early 2000s, they had an unlimited fishing season. They could go out and fish for red snapper 365 days a year. They never caught any. They could fish for it. Now what's happened since we're more tightly controlling the fishery and managing it, we have actually given them a limited season. And because of that limited season, population is rebuilding, it's being managed properly, but they can't fish all year round. But they catch more fish. So they are catching fish down at this level back when they had a year-round season. Now they're catching up this amount of fish. And they don't quite get the message that, okay, you're actually winning there, folks. So there's these unrealistic expectations, and some of that's our fault. We don't really necessarily explain the science well. And that's one of my mantras, is we need to communicate better as scientists. And then there's this issue of choke stocks. And probably the place where this is most commonly discussed is here in New England. And consider the situation where we've got two stocks. One is Georges Bank haddock, one is Georges Bank cod. As you probably heard, Georges Bank cod has been declining. That's the blue. And because of that, catch has had to go way down. Simultaneously, though, haddock, in the same time period roughly, has been increasing. The Georges Bank haddock population is very large, great biomass. But because of they cannot take cod as bycatch, they've had to reduce their fishing effort. So even though they got that much that they could catch, they're restrained the levels down in this area because of cod abundance. And that's awful. We're constrained under the Magnuson Act to deal with this. So we're hoping that if we reauthorize in the coming year the Magnuson Act, we can find some way out of this bind. Right now, we're sort of stuck with this. And it's hard. Another opportunity here, though, is the fishermen, particularly people using the trawl nets, can figure out a way to exclude cod from the net as a bycatch reduction measure. They can still fish, but that's a challenge. They're frequently found together. So how you exclude two species that are very similar, we found the same place, the same depth of water, is tough. That's a challenge. So, we had challenges back 40 years ago when we began this. Most everything was in trouble. And the agency, working with industry, working with our academic partners, have brought most of these populations back. This is a real success story internationally. Nobody in the world has done what we've been able to do. But there's consequences to this. The ecosystem trade-offs, there's the human interactions. That's the next big set of questions that we have to deal with. We have to come up with solutions to dealing with the other issues. And some of the key take-homes here is that recovery is a management task, and we didn't used to have a management part. But scientists can provide really good advice to make the management effort work better. We have these three different congressional mandates. Frequently, they're at odds with each other, so we continue to strive to come up with better ways to coordinate them. And finally, climate variability and ecosystem-based management have to be core elements for any future recovery efforts. In part because climate variability really is going to change where the stocks are, what their maximum population sizes are. We need to incorporate that into any science advice we provide to our managers. And then secondly, an ecosystem sort of approach is probably the best way to deal with these. Because frequently, as you've seen here, there are a lot of interactions which are really ecosystem type interactions. And unless we look at these problems in this context, we're not going to be able to solve them. Thank you.